All right, so as we work through this week's thought primer, I'm going to ask you to reflect on a feature of the theory we're exploring this week, virtue ethics, that is also a feature of natural law theory, the theory we explored last week, that distinguishes these two ethical theories from all of the other ethical theories that we explored this semester. And that feature is this, that for natural law theory and virtue ethics, the primary concern is on character and character development. So when you think back to libertarianism or utilitarianism or Kantianism, the primary concern there is identifying what kinds of actions are morally permissible, morally impermissible, morally obligatory. And the concern there is drawing lines that identifies what kinds of actions are allowed and disallowed, but not so much on you being a particular kind of person or having a particular kind of character. But in natural law theory and virtue ethics, the primary concern is not on just on identifying what actions are allowable and not allowable, but on who you should be. And what I mean by that is on what kind of a person should you be and what should you do in order to become that kind of person. So for natural law theory and virtue ethics, actions become almost like tools that we use to build our character, to create our character. So you think back to natural law theory and our exploration of that, and the concern there was order, disorder, harmony, human nature. And the central question there was, what do I need to do in order to actualize my purpose? Right? That I recognize that the universe has a purpose and I'm a part of the universe, and therefore, so what's my purpose and how can I act in a way that actualizes that purpose? In virtue ethics, the question's going to be really similar. The central question here is going to be, what do I need to do in order to actualize my potential? To be the best me that I can be, to be the best at being what I am, a human being. Now, I'm drawing this to your attention because there are these two worldviews, the worldview embodied by natural law theory and the worldview embodied by virtue ethics. I think a pretty good argument can be made that these two worldviews working hand in glove are in large part what's responsible for Western civilization. I think there's a strong argument to be made that we would not have Western civilization were it not for these two worldviews kind of working together. So natural law theory has its roots in Judaism, right? So that means that the worldview embodied by natural law theory it's almost 4,000 years old, right? And the worldview that's embodied or represented by virtue ethics goes back to ancient Greece. It goes back 2,400 years ago to the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. So these are really old worldviews that have had tremendous, almost undescribable power in building culture. Okay. Now I'm saying all of this to you not because I'm trying to persuade you to accept natural law theory or virtue ethics over all the other ethical theories. I'm saying all of this because I'm hearing more and more, and I have been hearing this more and more over the last few years, philosophers and historians making the argument that much of the chaos and discord and disillusionment and depression and anxiety, the sense of lostness that seems to define modern culture, is due, at least in part, to a turning away from these two worldviews for the sake of Enlightenment principles, right? So their argument is, we have these, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment period of the 17th, we probably can go back to the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and this sort of turning away from a world view that centers on the universe having a purpose and more towards a worldview that focuses on technology and science and what we can do to our environment with these very powerful tools. And you can kind of see, as a response to the scientific revolution, the attempt to develop a sort of religion-free, a God-free morality in utilitarianism or Kantianism, right? That these are very deliberate efforts to try to reclaim real moral principles without having to root them in either of these ancient worldviews. And as early as the late 19th century, the famous philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche saw where this was headed. And he famously proclaimed, God is dead. You've heard this, right? Nietzsche says God is dead. And a lot of people take that sentence out of context to claim that Nietzsche's sort of celebrating this idea, like, we've abandoned all these old superstitions because we're so much wiser and smarter now that we look at all of our fancy science and technology and how we don't need God anymore. They claim that Nietzsche was claiming. And if you read that in the context of that story, I think it's called The Madman, that's not at all what Nietzsche means when he says God is dead. Nietzsche's just making an observation, right? And what Nietzsche says in that is God's dead and we killed him, right? That's the part that people leave off. We killed him. And we killed him with our enlightenment, right? That we became gods and now there's no turning back. We can't turn back to those old worldviews. And because we can't turn back to those old worldviews, we've got to create our own values now. Right? And again, you can see how the utilitarians and Kant tried to do this. We need to create our own values now, Nietzsche says. But Nietzsche also realized, that's not possible. It's not possible for human beings to create their own values and have those values be real. Therefore, Nietzsche argued, the only thing that really matters is power. Right? And that's what Nietzsche claimed. And so a lot of philosophers and historians are now looking back at what Nietzsche was claiming, looking at the state of our world and saying, maybe, as William Butler Yeats famously said in a poem, the hell's the name of it? Anyway, the center cannot hold. The falcon does not hear the falconer. There's just a sense of chaos everywhere. So as you're reflecting on natural law theory and as you're working through virtue ethics this week, maybe have these ideas in the back of your mind and see if you can perceive the difference in the worldviews that these two ethical theories represent versus the worldviews that some of the other ethical theories we've explored represent and sort of what you observe going on in the culture around you today. Okay, so for virtue ethics, once again, the central concern, just like it was with natural law theory, is going to be this idea of purpose. And for the virtue ethicist, one of the central questions is, what are people for? Okay, what are they for? Another question that's going to be at the center of virtue ethics is this. Is it possible to be wealthy and living a fun life and at the same time not flourishing as a human being? Okay, so think about that question. Is it possible to have a good life and to be doing all the things and having fun and yet somehow be languishing as a human being, not really flourishing as a human being? So maybe think about this. What does it look like when you see a person who's flourishing? They seem to have everything kind of in right proportion. They kind of got it figured out. They're living the good life. And that's the last central question for virtue ethics is, what does it mean to live the good life? Not a good life, the good life. What is the good life? And what does it look like when somebody is living that? All right. So maybe keep these questions in the center of your mind as you work through this week's Thought Primer.